T&I committee kept us much longer than we thought. And I am going to beg the audience, both remote and presence, indulgence, because I'm going to eat my lunch while the witness is testifying. Otherwise, although I assume you wouldn't mind, but I may fall over. So with that, before we begin, Ray, do you have anything? I don't want to hear oral argument now because I want to get through this witness, but do you have anything to submit regarding the question of settlement negotiation?
Yes, Chairman. We have been in discussions with Amtrak on this, and so I mean, I could describe for you what the discussion was with the SRC, but both Amtrak and CSX would ask the board to not go down this line of inquiry because the meeting in question was entirely to discuss an offer of settlement that was submitted by CSX to Amtrak. We can go through the cases and the like, but just in order to protect the ongoing settlement discussions between the two parties, we would ask that you not ask this line of inquiry of Mr. Blair.
Well, here's what we're going to do. I want to actually have more disclosure of the facts of this meeting, but I do not want to do it now because I want to get through this witness and there will be time to do it. If in fact the board were to rule that we are going to question on that matter, we will do it at some later point. But if you were saying you were ready to make some kind of an oral presentation about the circumstances.
So why don't it, in order to move things along, and since Mr. Blair is not available today in any event, we'll put together a short pleading to go into the record for you to rule on, but just understand that both Amtrak and CSX are asking you not to inquire into the details of that meeting because it would disclose settlement discussions. Yes, sir.
We'll put that off later then, Ray, and I appreciate the report. Can we resume the well, I guess we finished the direct examination of Mr. Johansson. Am I saying that right? Ray, he's your witness. And as I do, to remind you, what I'd like you to do is question Mr. Johansson as much as you need to, up to the point where he began to discuss the contested exhibits. And at that point, we'll deal with your pending motion in limine.
Are we ready to proceed? Excellent. Mr. Johansson, as you know, my name is Ray Atkins. I represent CSX in this matter. I'll be asking you a few questions. My colleague, Mr. Donahoe, may have a few additional ones. Speak slower. So my name is Ray Atkins. I represent CSX in this matter. I'll be asking you a few questions. And then my colleague, Mr. Donahoe, may have a few when I'm done. Can you tell us when you were retained to work on this matter?
It was summer of 2021.
And as part of the scope of your work, did you or anyone from your team travel to the region to examine the operations on the line?
No.
So can you describe for me what happens if you add a movement to a line that has insufficient capacity as you've calculated it?
As you would increase the train count, that would add a demand on the line. Eventually, the count of that demand will exceed the count of our supply.
But my question is what happens if you tried to add a movement so that the demand exceeded the supply of capacity?
You would have a demand number that is greater than the supply number.
And can you provide some context in terms of what that would mean? Would it be gridlock?
Our methodology doesn't look at anything in terms of gridlock or dispatchability. It would just say that there is a demand. So that number for demand would be greater than the supply number.
Would you agree that adding movements to a line with insufficient capacity is likely to impair the operation of that line?
having a demand on the line greater than the supply would certainly add challenge to accommodate all of the demand placed on that section of the corridor.
But would it be likely to impair the operation of the line?
Our methodology doesn't look at it from impair or not. So all I'd be able to say is that the demand number is greater than the supply, and therefore you need to start looking at ways to get those back to either equal or to have more demand or more supply than demand.
But you're not in a position to tell the board what would happen if you added movements to a line where the demand now exceeded the supply of capacity.
I guess in what way? Like the ability to run a railroad?
Yes, the ability to run a railroad, to dispatch trains, to have local traffic on the line, the speed of the line. What I need to know from your expertise as a operating expert, what happens to the line if you add trains in excess of the supply of capacity?
Yeah, so you would, from a planning standpoint, you would want to look at what are the mitigations to get this. So whether we can make operational changes or technological changes or infrastructure changes to get essentially the demand below the supply. In real life, speaking from my experience running a railroad, there are times where a real railroad, maybe not by plan, but by circumstance, will have a situation where there's a lot of demand on the road, and then you take operational mitigations in that period to accommodate the traffic.
And can you describe the types of activities a railroad would need to do to accommodate the traffic?
Yeah, so you may, by circumstance, will have might do is you may pull traffic kind of out and find ways to divert traffic. You may push off a track maintenance window by a day until things restore. You may fleet trains in one direction because you can, rather than trying to run a railroad bidirectionally. Those are things that can kind of temporarily get you a little bit more out of your capacity until the railroad is back to a fluid state.
Did you review the testimony of Mr. Johnson in the port about how the 4 passenger trains will consume capacity in Mobile if there is no dedicated passenger track at the station?
What you doing? Drink some more water.
I don't hear the mics on. I hear that overhead. People who are listening online.
If there's someone on the Zoom call that isn't on mute, we ask that you mute your microphone.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. Did you review the testimony of Mr. Johnson in the Port of Mobile about how the 4 passenger trains will consume capacity in Mobile if there's no dedicated passenger track at the station? would you agree that Amtrak's proposal to use the Choctaw Yard as a layover location will mean that there will be 8 movements to and from the Mobile station over the main line track?
Yes,
And so that would mean that there'd be 4 what you refer to as revenue generating movements, and then 4 movements per day that would be non-revenue generating, correct?
yes.
So if I can turn to page 22 of your report, this is going to be, I'm going to use tab 4, which is the public version, although it's also public in the yeah, it's tab 4, page 22. Actually, maybe, sorry, it's page 22 of your report. It's page 24 of the actual exhibit. It's got up at the top corner, Mobile to Berkeley.
The bottom, it's 24 and our number was 22.
Correct.
Okay.
Just going to take a moment to let everyone get there. Okay. So in your report, you've concluded that there is, quote, insufficient capacity to handle the non-revenue movements of trains to and from Choctaw Yard, paren, as is currently proposed by Amtrak, end paren, end quote. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And to remedy that problem, you're recommending the construction of a, quote, station pocket track, to use your end quote, to use your terminology, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you state in this report that it's your opinion that doing so would prevent, quote, the continuous consumption of capacity on the main line, end quote, in the Mobile terminal, correct?
That's correct.
Are you aware that that a recommendation for a station pocket track, as you call it, is also recommended by Norfolk Southern and CSX in this case?
That is my understanding, yes.
Are you further aware that a recommendation for a dedicated station track at the Mobile station was also identified as an essential project in the Gulf Coast Working Group 2017 report to Congress?
Gulf Coast Working Group report.
Okay. Are you aware that there is no station pocket track at the Mobile station at this time?
Yes.
Are you aware that Amtrak is demanding the right to begin operations over the line with no station pocket track at the Mobile station?
That is my understanding, yes.
Given that you concluded, quote, there is insufficient capacity to handle the non-revenue movements each day that will traverse to and from the Choctaw Yard, end quote, would you agree that forcing those 4 daily movements onto the line will impair operations in the Mobile terminal?
I can't make an assessment if it would impair, though it would certainly be something that would need to be managed through until either operational changes could be made or the track is constructed.
So can you talk to me about, is it possible that adding a passenger train to a rail corridor that is mostly single track with movable bridges and limited sidings will slow existing traffic on the line? I need to know, is that possible?
Through our methodology, we don't assess that. So I think the answer is no, I don't know if that is possible.
So let me just clarify. So you're saying your methodology doesn't assess whether adding passenger trains to the line would slow existing traffic?
Whether a passenger train or a freight train or any type of train, our methodology looks at capacity, consumption, and quantifies it.
But my question was, so what you just said though is what it doesn't do is assess whether it would slow existing traffic. Okay, so I was asking this question in the theoretical question rather than as it applies to your work, Mr. Johansson. Just would you agree that is a theoretical matter that adding trains can slow existing traffic over a segment before you hit the sort of maximum theoretical capacity of the segment?
Not necessarily. No, I would not agree with that.
So would it be possible that adding traffic can slow existing traffic over the segment before you hit the maximum theoretical capacity?
I think it depends on how you manage and operate the railroad. Adding traffic could force the need, because you need to manage all of the traffic that's on a railroad within limited infrastructure, particularly in a real-time scenario, that as you add trains, you're actually forced to figure out ways in very short time period to run the railroad more efficiently so that you can handle all of the demand on the existing infrastructure.
So I appreciate it might do that, but my question is, theoretically, when you add traffic to a line, is it possible that doing so will slow traffic on the line?
I think any range of possibilities is theoretically possible.
Would you agree that congestion on one segment can have a ripple effect and slow traffic on a nearby segment?
Would depend on the scenario, possibly.
So my question was, can it have a ripple effect and slow it on traffic? Is your answer yes?
Yes, again, it would depend on the scenario.
Would you also agree that the closer you come to hitting the maximum theoretical capacity of the line, the more likely adding trains will slow existing traffic?
Again, not necessarily. In our analysis in other corridors, we've actually found that as train counts increase, variability decreases, which goes back, I think, to my earlier statement about how when you have more of a demand on a corridor, and again, with limited infrastructure, in real time, you have to reconcile that because you have to keep, or you want to keep a railroad moving. So you actually figure out ways to use the infrastructure as efficiently as possible to accommodate the demands.
So I think I heard you just say, though, that it has been your experience that the variability on the line is a function, it can be a function of the amount of traffic that's on the line?
What we have found in other places where we've done this type of analysis is actually where train count increases, variability goes down.
Right. But so again, so my question, though, is that you in your experience, the variability is not constant. It can change with the amount of traffic that's on the line.
Yes.
Thank you. Would you agree that the supply of capacity on a line can be limited by a single bottleneck segment?
Depends on how you want to use the corridor. If you don't want to run as much through a constrained section, and your demand there in that constrained section is not necessarily the same demand you have in the other corridor, it's not necessarily a limiting factor.
Well, let me give you a hypothetical, see if I can tease that out a little bit. So this might be too long of a hypothetical, but hope you can follow me. So let's assume you've got 3 segments. The first one's double tracked and has a capacity of 20 trains per day. Second one is just single tracked with no siding, so it's got a maximum capacity of 5 trains per day. And then you've got a third one, which is again double tracked with a maximum capacity of 20 trains per day. Wouldn't you agree that the maximum theoretical capacity or throughput for the entire line is 5 trains per day?
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
So in your analysis, you have a section that we're going to call a bottleneck, but it's a section right in the middle of the line where the supply of capacity is lower than anywhere else in the line. Isn't that correct?
Yes. There is one section, yes.
So just to clarify, so I'm going to turn to page 28 of tab 6.
Right, I don't think it's tab 6. That's the
Oh,
TV project.
I'm sorry, tab 8. Tab 8, my apologies. Thank you, Jesse. Page 28. And again, although this says highly confidential, it's been redesignated as public.
I'm on page 28.
Okay. Could you identify for our benefit the segment that I'm referring to?
I believe you're referring to the section between Gautier and Beauvoir.
And the section before it also from Orange to Gautier, that although is not a bottleneck, it is fully constrained in your analysis. Is that correct?
The supply and demand is equal, so it's fully consumed.
Okay. So I may come back to this particular stretch, but I'm just going to refer to those two together as the bottleneck segment. That'll be my language, not your language, just to help you. And just to clarify, according to your analysis, every scrap of supply of capacity is consumed by demand over this bottleneck segment when you add 4 passengers per train, 4 passenger trains. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So I'd like to turn to your calculation of the variability factor. The variability factor is intended to capture the effect of local traffic on the speed that trains can traverse each segment. Is that correct?
Can you repeat that again, please?
So as I understand, the variability factor is capturing every feature of the line that might affect the ability of the trains to traverse it from one side to the other. So for example, if there's a local traffic on the line that is impeding the trains, that's captured in your variability factor.
The variability factor is tied to the train. So it's about a performance of the train. It's not about how a train maybe affects another train. So it's tied to the performance of a specific train.
And so, but the performance of a train is affected by the amount of local traffic that's on the line.
The performance of a train is affected by anything that causes it, in our methodology, to not adhere to the performance profile of a standard train. So it could be waiting for another train. It could be waiting for a local. It could be track work. It could be a whole variety of things that happen every day on a railroad.
Okay. Yeah, that's the point I'm trying to get. I'm just trying to tease out some of the specifics from that big bundle that you're talking about. So for example, the variability factor is intended to capture the effect of movable bridges, sorry, on the speed that trains can traverse each segment. That's right.
If a train is delayed by a movable bridge, then that event is captured in variability.
It's also, the variability factor captures the effects of congestion around the yards on the speed that a particular train can traverse each segment. Is that correct?
Yes, again, any delay, and it could be delay near terminals, is captured in there. However, we also have a staging metric that captures, very long delays anywhere on the corridor, but in my experience, they typically happen near terminals.
So I think I've already asked you this, but just to summarize, that the single variability factor of 1.4 that you've calculated is intended to capture all the features of the Gulf Coast line that might affect how fast a train can traverse the corridor. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So I just wanted some hypotheticals to understand how the variability factor might move. So would you agree that if all the local traffic were to disappear, that this would change the variability factor?
Not necessarily knowing what drives, what drives all of the variability factors. I would say I don't know specific to a local, but any train that can get across the railroad consistently against the standard train would have less variability in it.
So I want clarification. So my question is really just, theoretically, if all the local traffic were to disappear, that would change the variability factor, correct? You don't know, you don't need to tell me how it would change it or what degree, just that it would change.
The short answer is I don't know, because I don't know how any one given train that is delayed by a local train. I guess theoretically, no trains ever delayed by a local, in which case the local trains disappearing doesn't have any impact on the variability number.
So let me pick one that's, I think is easier. Would you agree that if all the movable bridges were to disappear, that would change the variability factor?
Yes, that would.
Now I'm going to flip it around, and although I may know your answer, would you agree that if you expected the amount of local traffic to double, would that change?
What that looks like, how it's done, I don't know in theory.
Okay, let me ask you instead of would it, how about is it possible that it would change the variability factor in your expert opinion?
It is possible, again, depending on what the service plan and how those locals work. Yes, in theory, it could negatively affect the variability number.
And I think you've actually already said that this has been your experience, but I have it here in my notes. Would you agree that the variability factor, which is, as you defined it, the difference between the speed that it actually traverses line against what you're predicting from your model, that variability factor is a function of the total amount of traffic on the line? Yes, that's correct. Thank you. So I'm going to turn to your staging and off-ramp movements. And for various segments of the line, you've calculated the amount of capacity that is consumed by staging and on-ramp, off-ramp movements. Or you've referred to it just on-ramp movements. For my benefit, could you start with the staging? Could you explain how you specifically calculated the amount of capacity consumed by staging, taking as an illustration the staging number that you've got for the main line 2 between Seibert Yard and Choctaw Yard?
Yeah, so if you can imagine, a train proceeds down a corridor, train passes signals, those events are recorded. A train that's staged will maybe pass, call it illustratively, pass point A, comes to a stop. Maybe the crew's taken off, maybe the crew sits on there. After 3 hours, the train resumes movement, passes by point B. And so what we're looking for is a train that went by A and then was expected to go by B, but didn't go by B for essentially over 3 hours from when it was expected to go by. That goes into staging. And that number, we picked, I think mostly, and we've carried that number through our other studies. So that wasn't a number developed for this corridor. That is a number that kind of, sort of a cutoff between what is a train being held out just because the terminal is not ready, but we're trying to get the train, someone's trying to get the train in the yard, and a dividing line between essentially a conscious activity that we're going to halt this train and we're going to try again later to bring it in, or we'll have room later to bring it in, or the connecting carrier will be ready at that time to bring it in.
And can you explain how you calculated the on-ramp movement? How that places a demand on just the actual calculation? How did you calculate the number? For example, again, there's a small amount of it shown on the main line between Seibert and Choctaw Yard.
So we're looking at, there is an on-ramp and off-ramp we're using really as a way to try to kind of talk, and we've used the same terminology in our other studies to kind of talk to a non-rail audience, is thinking of as a train has to enter or exit a rail corridor, it's sort of coming on or off-ramp, just like you would like a road. So that's how we come up with the term off-ramp or on-ramp. The way we calculate it is we look at the number of events of trains entering and exiting a rail yard. Using our planning tool, we have a conservative estimate on the speed that the train can enter the yard, because the trains usually have to enter very slowly, maybe stop and align switches. And we calculate that additional time that it would take for that train to get all the way into the yard and become clear of the main line. We then take that time and we allocate that to additional units of capacity consumed.
So coming back to the staging, can you describe the data that you used to determine when you were when you were going to how you calculated the staging calculation? What data did you look at?
We used the CSX OS data from, I believe it was September through November 2019. So the OS data is signal system data of a particular train passing a particular point at a particular date and time.
So you didn't, but and so from that data was sufficient for you to calculate the staging. You didn't have to use, I'm going to mispronounce it, but you've used it's a European model, the Variability model or something to that effect. Did you use that model at all to calculate the staging?
No, we did not use Variability for the calculation of the staging.
Okay, and so you've got the calculation of the staging and on the on-ramp. Were these calculations separate and distinct from your calculation of the variability factor?
Yes, they were.
Thank you. Okay, so let me turn again back to the variability factor. Would you agree that this variability factor is a critically important mathematical input into your model?
Yes.
So I'm just going to lay out my understanding of how you calculate it, but just please, obviously correct me if I'm wrong. So you say that for each movement over the line during a 3-month period, you first calculated what I'm calling the predicted transit time of that movement. Is that right?
We calculate the standard train. The standard train is our, the standard train operational profile from one end of the corridor to the other, which provides an operational profile that we can make comparisons to as we go through our process.
Would it be okay for me to just refer to that shorthand as the predicted time from your model?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so then you take a look at the actual transit time and the difference, the actual transit time minus the predicted, and the difference is your variability for each movement. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And then you looked at every movement from September through November to 2019. And so in your server rebuttal, for example, you say, I'll need to refer, it just sounds like this is, you aggregated all historic train runtimes and compared to the modeled standard train runtimes, and the average is then recorded as a variability metric, end quote. Is that correct?
Yes.
So did you use the mean and not the median? Is that correct?
Yes, I believe we used the mean.
And did you exclude outliers in your calculation of the mean?
No, we didn't exclude outliers. The only thing that we excluded is events that would have fallen in that train staging bucket.
Okay, so I think that's where we're going because that's not entirely clear from your calculation. So so let me we'll get there. But for all these individual movements, you resulted in a 1.4 factor that you used for both northbound and southbound movements.
That's correct.
And this means on average, it takes a freight train about 140% longer to cross the corridor than the modeled standard train runtime, correct?
Yeah, yes. So for every train that you would run, we would say that a train consumes an additional 1.4 units of capacity.
And it just happenstance that the average factor is the same for both northbound and southbound movements?
Yeah, they weren't exactly the same, but they were very close.
Okay. If the numbers had been more, had been different to a greater degree, would you have needed to apply a different variability factor for the northbound and southbound movements?
We would have taken we probably would have taken the higher of the two. Yeah, we would have taken the higher of the two.
Okay, so if the northbound movement had a variability factor of 2.0 and the southbound movement had a variability factor of 1.4, you would have used 2.0 in your analysis?
Yes.
Okay. So Mr. Johansson, when we go into your work papers, it is apparent that before you calculated the average of 1.4, you screened all of the data to throw away any movement with a variability above 0.187. Is that correct?
No, I don't believe that is correct.
Okay, so at this point in time, we're going to need to go into a highly confidential, because what we're going to do is we're going to pull up his work papers and we're going to show the filters that were applied and how the mean was calculated. Nope, no, we're going in once and then that's it.
Usha, can you, whoever is sending us these days, send this to the highly confidential?
We can, Marty, just give me 2 seconds. I'm just getting the confidential folks out.
All right, and let me know when you're there.
You should be in the room now, Marty.
Chairman, should I just proceed or do you want me to? I don't know
No,
when.
I think you can proceed.
Okay. I lost my train of thought. So you indicated you can't point us to the work paper to support the calculation of 0.187, which was the filter that you applied. Is that correct?
No, I can't.
So, Mr. Johansson, if your calculation for this average is unsupported by a work paper, is the results of your report unreliable given the central importance of this calculation to the analysis?
No, not at all. As I talked about, we identified trains that were 3 hours that were held for 3 hours longer. We took those out. The remainder goes into the variability calculation.
And so can you explain how 3 hours corresponds to 0.187 as a filter that you applied to variability factor? Can you do the math for us? How do you get from 3 hours of staging to 0.187?
So that number, the number aligns with the number of units capacity in an hour. And there's, I think, just about, I think about how this works again. There's, since there's only about 1 unit of capacity per direction per hour, it comes out to just about, essentially right at about 2, or right under 2, because we have the one that's consumed by the train, plus the additional units consumed for essentially the next hour and the following hour. So that's where, and it comes out to right about just under 2.
But there's no so I'm not sure I follow the math, but there's no explanation for that in your report. And there's no work paper that you can point us to calculate this very specific 0.187 calculation. Okay. So when you calculate the variability for this line, you're looking at, you have I think I was going to call it like a predicted train speed from your model that you compare the actual to. Do you calculate that predicted train speed for each segment of the line, and then it adds up, and then depending on how many segments the movement hits, that will be the aggregated predicted train speed for the line?
Variato has a train performance calculator in it, similar to various other types of rail planning tools. We input in train length, weight, number, or locomotive horsepower, and then it has a train performance calculator that it uses to calculate the travel time between stations on a corridor.
So what I'm trying to understand is, did you look at the variability? Could you have looked at, well, let me ask you the question this way. Let me try this. Which segment of this line has the highest variability factor?
We didn't look at it in a station-to-station perspective. We looked at it over the entire corridor.
So you don't know how much higher the variability factor in Mobile is than the average variability of the line?
No, we do not.
And if it had a higher variability factor, that would reflect all the difficulties of operations in that region, right? From the crowded yards, the movable bridges, the foreign trains, the local traffic, that would all be captured in the variability of traversing the Mobile station.
Particularly around terminal areas, a lot more of that variability is driven by trains that sit for an extensively long time, such as over 3 hours. So a lot of those types of trains sitting, waiting to get into a terminal are captured in staging. So is it perhaps a little bit higher around terminal? Yeah, I guess it could be, but we also separately capture a lot of those activities that go on around a terminal in staging.
So you probably didn't examine the variability factor around the Gentile yard and whether it's materially different from the average of the entire line?
We did not.
So I'm just going to ask you a hypothetical then, since you didn't do any analysis on this, just want to understand if so. Let's assume you've got 2 segments again these are of equal length. Just try to hold them constant. Now let's assume the first segment has multiple movable bridges, bridge tender movements, lots of local traffic, and dozens of foreign trains crossing the line every day. And now we're going to have the second segment that has no movable bridges, no bridge tenders, no local traffic, and no foreign trains crossing the line. Would you agree that the first segment is going to have a higher variability factor than the second?
Depending on how the trains operate and what a service, how the service plan is executed. One with kind of more challenges could have certainly has additional challenges versus a segment that maybe just has to worry about speed restriction or temporary speed restrictions and other things.
Okay. Yet in your analysis, you're using the same average variability factor for all the segments on this line. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So your model is treating a segment with lots of movable bridges, lots of local traffic and other features as consuming the same amount of capacity as a stretch of track that might have completely clear sailing.
Yes, we use a consistent value across the corridor.
Okay, so now keeping on this calculation of your variability factor, you're using an average variability factor of 1.4. Is that correct? Yeah, I'm gonna try to stop asking you that question because we know what the number is. But so tell me what the standard deviation of that calculation was.
I do not know.
Will there be days where the Gulf Coast line will experience operating variability that's above the average?
Yes.
But your entire analysis is premised on using an average variability over 3 months. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Did you calculate how frequently the actual variability will exceed the 1.4 variability used in your model?
We did not.
So we're still, I think we're on the same slide, which is 21 tab 2. If you look at that visually, you can see a lot of days where the actual is well above the average. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
So since you didn't calculate it, I'm going to assume a number for conversational purposes. So just to be conservative, let's assume that 25% of the days, the line will experience above average variability that's above the 1.4.
Sorry, say that one more time.
So I didn't actually ask a question, but so what I'd like to do is I just want to use a number for simplicity. So let's just assume that about 25% of the time, the line will experience above average variability. So though 25% of the days, you're going to have variability above 1.4. So my question is, so that's just assumption I'm asking you for my next series of questions since you didn't calculate a number. So let's return to the bottleneck that you detected in the middle of the line, where every scrap of capacity is used from Orange Grove to Beauvier. That analysis is based on the average variability. So if the actual experience will exceed the average 25% of the time, then your model predicts that adding 4 trains a day will exceed the maximum theoretical capacity 25% of the time. Is that correct? Understanding 25% is just a hypothetical, whatever that number actually is.
I'm not following the logic here.
Yeah, let me try another line. So you have detected on the bottleneck that you've exactly consumed the amount of capacity, the supply of capacity, when you add the 4 trains based on the average variability of the line of 1.4. Is that correct?
Yes.
So every day where the actual variability exceeds the average, you're going to exceed the capacity on that portion of the segment. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so turning to the use of a simulation model, you described in your report that a dynamic simulation model can be used to find locations and occurrences of delay and then to investigate potential solutions to solve the problem. Is that statement accurate?
Point him to the statement.
Page 4 of the server rebuttal, which I believe is tab 7.
Okay, and where am I looking?
It's the first paragraph.
Of which page again?
Page 4. Second sentence.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just asking if you continue to believe that a dynamic simulation model can be used to find locations and occurrences of delay and then investigate potential solutions and solve the problem.
Yes, still agree with that.
Is the RTC model considered a dynamic simulation model in your view?
Yes.
Okay. So turning to the last sentence, you say that in that first paragraph, sorry, just while the DB methodology may not initially have simulation data behind it. So when you use the word may not initially, is that a recognition that using dynamic simulation models like RTC are often added to the DB methodology?
What we're trying to convey is that the work we do can feed a simulation model. Doesn't necessarily have to feed a simulation model, but can be used to essentially investigate solutions and put it in and test it with a simulation model.
Does your team have expertise in using the RTC model?
While we do have staff that have RTC experience, we don't do RTC modeling.
So you don't have a license for the RTC model?
No, we do not.
Okay. So I'm going to turn to this issue of representative trains. So you testified in your rebuttal report, I'm going to call it, sorry, the reply report, that it's critical that the capacity is calculated through a process of determining the representative unit of capacity for the rail corridor.
Can you
Hold on a
point him
second.
to the page again?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm sorry, it's the same document. It is the SIR rebuttal. So on page 5, just flip a page, tab 7, and it's the first full paragraph. I'll just give you a moment to refresh your memory.
Okay, I've read the first paragraph.
Okay, so you're testifying. This is your description of what a unit capacity is. It's established. It's based on a determination of a standard train. The unit of capacity established is based on a determination of a standard train. Is that right? And then this is your description of a standard train. The standard train is representative of the type of trains that could potentially be operated on the corridor.
Yes.
Okay. The standard train you used in this report is 11,000 feet long. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Are you aware that there's no sidings along this corridor that can fit an 11,000 foot train?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so if we can flip back to your demonstrative, which is tab 8. I'm going to go back to the same. Hold on a second. This is page 28, which is your depiction of the line with all of the various demands of the supply.
Okay, I'm there.
So looking at this from all the way from Seibert Yard to Mobile, it certainly would appear that you're representing that this line could handle, say, 10 through trains from New Orleans to Seibert Yard within the current capacity of the line. Would 10 be? Would you agree with that 10 fits comfortably in your analysis?
What we're saying is that this is the current train count on the current train count on the corridor.
And flowing a 10 through is not going to exceed because you've got a little bit of extra room in the places where it's below 10 and then it's actually above 10 elsewhere. So it would appear that this has the capacity to handle 10 trains per day traversing the line. Is that correct?
I would say it has the ability to handle the traffic on the line today, and in sections where that count is 10, then yes, it is handling 10 trains.
Do you see anything in this chart that would suggest it can't handle 10 trains a day?
No.
Okay, so here's my question for you: does it have the capacity to handle 10, 11,000 foot trains per day in each direction?
Well, that's not how the standard train is used. The standard train is not to say that every train is 11,000 foot train. A standard train is to just define an operational profile. You could run a 4,000 foot train. We're just comparing how that 4,000 foot train compares time-wise across the corridor versus the 11,000 foot train. You could run a 13,000 foot long train, and that's compared back to how the 11,000 foot train would run across the corridor. We're not saying that you could run 10, 11,000 foot trains or, any sort of lane. We're just talking about an operational comparison to a particular type of train to make our comparisons back to.
So your statement that the standard train is representative of the type of trains that could potentially be operated on this corridor, was that statement inaccurate?
No, I mean, it encompasses up to the 95th percentile, of which there are many trains that are under that. In fact, 95% of trains are at or less than 11,000 feet in length and at or less than 17,000 tons.
So can you, based on this report, offer an opinion as to whether or not this line has the capacity to handle 10, 11,000 foot trains per day in each direction?
Depending on what a service plan for those trains would be, you'd have to create one. So maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know.
And do you know where any of those 11,000 foot trains would meet and pass each other between North and Chile Yard and Choctaw Yard?
Depends on a service plan. If there was a service plan that said we want to run 10,000 foot trains, then you can make a service plan where you have 5 10,000 foot trains that follow each other one way, and then have 5 10,000 foot trains that follow each other the other way and cross the corridor. We're not talking about we're talking about the capacity of making the standard train doesn't even is an operational profile. It's not about whether or not you can run 11,000 foot train and every side needs to be 11,000 feet. It's really about the runtime characteristics across the corridor of that train and making comparisons back to it.
So Mr. Johansson, the RTC model though could answer the question of whether or not you could run 10, 11,000 foot trains across this corridor. Isn't that correct?
I don't know if the RTC model could do that. I don't know.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I need a ruling on the motion in limine.
Ray, are you otherwise finished with your cross-examination?
No.
Well, how much more time do you have outside of those matters?
I don't know, 10 minutes, maybe. I'm getting there, but I'd like to.
Are you saying if you were going to be required to cross-examine them on the matters you're challenging, this would be the flow? This is where you'd like to put it in? Is that why you'd like the ruling now rather than finishing? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir.
That's an unreasonable request. I will say that I have given this issue a great deal of thought since yesterday. And paid as close attention as I could to Mr. Johansson's explanation for these additional exhibits. And just so I have the record clear, what is the number that you are challenging? Which page numbers, Ray?
Just one second. I just want to make sure so it would start on page 33 of the demonstrative and run through 59.
And that's tab 8, correct?
Tab 8, correct.
And I have found, and I'm going to recommend to the board, that after listening to Mr. Johansson, that these exhibits go beyond simply depicting data that was supplied by the railroads, but required some analysis and use of a software, the Tableau program, and required some, and I'm not saying it was done incorrectly or improperly, I assume it was done in good faith, but nevertheless required judgment calls and decision-making by Mr. Johansson as to how to portray this data. And therefore, I think it does constitute actual opinion evidence beyond just depicting. I think it had just been an attempt to depict data in some neutral fashion. The outcome may be different, but I think it does represent additional opinion evidence that was not previously disclosed. Mr. Johansson said he could have done all of these charts before he filed his original opinion, and therefore I'm going to recommend that the board grant the motion in limine and bar the admission of, give me pages 33 through 57.
Yes, sir.
And all of the testimony that accompanied it to strike it. What is the pleasure of the board?
Mr. Chair, may I be heard prior to the board's ruling?
Well, you can be, but we've really heard a lot of argument
Okay,
about it.
I just was going to ask the board whether the board would make a ruling slide by slide on whether they actually are new analysis or whether they are just visual depictions. For example, slide 33.
You know, I listened to it as a whole. And it was my view that it was very hard to separate it out slide by slide. If you think there's some way to separate that out and a showing can be made out, we're not going to finish by today. So you could attempt to make such a showing, but based on everything we've heard, I think the proper ruling is to bar all of the slides and the testimony of the accompaniment, and therefore with the consent of the board, which it seems to be the board's view, the motion in limine will be granted and all of the testimony will be stricken. Jesse, if you want to demonstrate some reason to reconsider that on a slide-by-slide basis, I suppose you can file anything you want because we're not going to close the record today anyway.
Understood, Mr. Chair. I'll just say for the record, I think that this is inconsistent with how some of CSX and NS's evidence has been presented and allowed in the very liberal standards that the board has applied toward their witnesses going well beyond what was in their verified statements. But I understand your ruling and we will file something if need be. Thank you.
And you may even be right, but you know, we normally, for the most part, I totally have not, you know, have responded to objections, and much, if not all, of the evidence you're talking about from the other side went in without objection.
Actually, Mr. Chair, I did object, and the board overruled my objection on the grounds that the board was interested in hearing the testimony, even though it went well beyond what the witnesses had testified to.
There were some such instances. I agree with you. But nevertheless, this evidence doesn't seem to rise to that standard. So Ray, you should then proceed to finish your cross-examination.
Okay. Mr. Johansson, it appears from your report that you didn't calculate the variability factor or the staging factor or the on-ramp factor or anything else for the trains running on the Norfolk Southern system in the New Orleans terminal. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I'm going to leave any additional questions from my colleague, Mr. Donahoe. So let me come back to the staging number that you calculated in this case. So, and again, we'll probably conclude with coming back to the same slide that we've been on for a while. Hold on a second. It's the page 28 again of tab 8, which is the slide which shows you the capacity available.
Yep, still there.
So you've assumed, you calculated a level of staging that, sorry, you calculate a level of staging that would consume capacity in the Mobile station, for example. And can you describe like, not just how how the number was calculated, but why these trains are being staged in that area for over 3 hours, in your opinion?
I guess I don't have an opinion as to why very specifically within Mobile, but from my experience, trains are held because there's nowhere to go with them.
So there's nowhere to go with them. So there's congestion on the line that's requiring them to stage the trains for 3 hours or longer because just of the complexity, the operating complexities of the Mobile terminal?
I don't know specifically to Mobile terminal. Thinking to my Chicago experience, we would often hold trains going to connecting carriers where the underlying issue that resulted in BNSF holding the train was at a facility far beyond Chicago, such as a power plant in often like in Michigan. So the problem may not be right near the problem causing the train to be held or staged may not necessarily be happening right at the point that the train is being stopped at.
Thank you. That's helpful. So, but it's the staging is a function of the fluidity of the line, the use of the line, the other demands being placed on it. Sometimes it's necessary to stage a train, to wait, hold it there, and then you send it along the line when there's room for it to traverse.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So is the amount of staging that takes place in a terminal like Mobile or New Orleans a function of the amount of traffic generally in that terminal? So if the terminal were empty, would you expect to see much staging?
Yeah, I would say that trains tend to be held near terminals. You wouldn't, though not always, trains tend to be held near terminals. So I think going back to my previous answer, it may not always be at a problem that is right at the point where that train is being held, but trains do tend to be held near terminals and not in kind of places in between major terminals.
Okay, so all I'm really trying to establish, I think sounds like you're agreeing, is that it may be due to something that's far away, but if you, as you add congestion to a line, the amount of staging may go up. I guess in theory it might go down, but the amount of staging you need is a function of the amount of traffic that's on the line.
I don't want to try to draw any sort of like correlation between, that there's some sort of direct ratio of number of trains on a line to staging. But often trains do have to be held for some particular reason because a terminal, whether locally or maybe a facility or another terminal down the line, maybe in some, number, could be hundreds of miles, could be 10 miles, is not ready to take the train.
And your staging calculation was based on 2019, during which time there were no passenger trains operating over this line. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you are holding the amount of staging, the hours of staging constant when you added four passenger trains per day. Is that correct? Does your methodology have any way to actually simulate or predict how much the staging would go up or down when you add the 4 passenger trains per day?
No, our methodology doesn't try to does not try to make a prediction on that.
And when I heard you say it not only does not, but it cannot.
Right. Yes.
But the RTC model can simulate how much staging would go up or down by adding 4 passengers per day. Is that correct?
I don't know what RTC could or couldn't do.
Okay. You calculated the amount of time that's consumed by these on-ramp, off-ramp movements based on 2019 information where there were no passenger trains operating over this line. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in your methodology, you held the amount of time constant when you added 4 passenger trains per day? And again, is your methodology capable of predicting how much time on-ramp, off-ramp time would increase or decrease when you add 4 passenger trains per day?
Well, we wouldn't. A passenger train being on a railroad doesn't affect how long it takes a train once it starts into a yard to get in or get out. So from our methodology standpoint, adding a passenger train to the corridor doesn't change that.
So it isn't possible that a train might have to hold longer because the passenger train is coming down the line and it can't off ramp or can't come out onto the main line?
Entering a yard, it would enter a yard that goes back to variability, and departing a yard, it doesn't change the ability of the time it takes for the train to depart the yard once a passenger train goes by.
But if it can't actually get out of the yard because the passenger train it needs priority so the passenger train can traverse, isn't it going to have to wait longer in the yard before it comes out?
I would say it's like I said, that's a theoretical in that from an operating plan standpoint, you know where the passenger trains are at and you develop it. I'm sorry, where the passenger trains are at and you know the schedule and you have an operating plan that aligns with the passenger or I'm not even, let me say that again. All of the plans then align because you have an operating plan for the corridor.
When you added the passenger trains into this model and you consumed units, did you add a variability factor to the passenger trains?
No, in our experience in other places, we've looked at variability of passenger train movements and the number was 0.
So does that assume sort of an on-time performance of 100%?
It doesn't make any sort of assumption on-time performance other than that the passenger trains do generally when they're out running, they do very well of aligning with their schedule. But we don't make an assumption that the train runs 100% across the corridor.
Okay, then returning to the variability factor, and we touched on this a little bit, but I just want to make sure I get the whole kind of list of factors you've identified. So this variability factor captures everything associated with the dynamic nature of operating over the line. You say it basically in your server rebuttal, page 6, but I'm not sure we need to go there. You say the variability is introduced through a variety of factors outside of the control of the railroads, and then you list a series of factors, which include, and let me run through each one of them and see if you agree that these affect the variability. The local train work events, that affects the variability.
Local train, that would fall into variability, yes.
Temporary track restrictions could affect the variability.
Yes.
Work windows and terminal congestion issues.
Yes.
Holding trains short for highway rail crossings.
Yes.
Train stopped for movable bridges. And a term you referred to as, quote, other varied line congestion issues.
Yes.
But when you added the 4 passenger trains per day, you assumed the variability factor of 1.4 will not change. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Can you point anywhere in your report where you justify an assumption that the variability of the line will remain constant?
No, not that I can think of, no.
In fact, your methodology has no way of determining how the variability factor will be changed by adding passenger trains because its calculation is based on historical 2019 data. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's based off of actual historical operating data.
So you can't tell the STB how the variability factor would change if movable bridges were automated or if all the trains on line were shortened to fit into all the sidings, can you?
No.
A dynamic simulation model like RTC can answer those questions though, correct?
I don't know.
Mr. Johnson, do you understand that the inquiry in this case is what will happen to the existing railroad operations on the line when you add 4 passenger trains per day?
That's my general understanding, yes.
And that inquiry includes determining how train performance on the line will be impacted, such as how it will slow down trains or local traffic will be affected and what will happen to interchange partners? And the fluidity of this line, the performance of the trains on the particular route, which is the variability factors you calculated, is assumed to remain constant at 1.4 before and after you add the passenger trains.
Yes.
So, Mr. Johansson, are you familiar with the joke about the economist, the engineer, and the physicist who are trapped on a desert island and a can of tuna fish wash ups on shore? and they're asked how to open it, and the economist says, let's assume I have a can opener?
Objection. I don't even know what to call it.
Not
Ray,
particularly.
your question speaks for itself. Ask another question.
Thank you. Mr. Johansson, haven't you assumed away the very empirical question this hearing is intended to answer?
Objection, argumentative.
I have no more further questions.
Listening, trying to listen carefully to your very detailed testimony, and it's a very impressive amount of work you've done. But here's where I'm stuck for the moment. And if I've missed it, I want you to tell me. Is there anything in your study that tells us beyond capacity whether the institution of passenger trains will have any impact, for example, on the velocity of the freight trains on this line? I just don't see that in your study. For example, in the RTC study proposed by the railroads, for whatever it's worth, says, well, the velocity will be reduced by 4.5%. Do you say anything about velocity in your report?
No, we don't. Our methodology here is, about calculating the capacity and calculating the demand on that capacity and giving you by you, I mean stakeholders, an idea of what are going to be what are the needs of the corridor, and then helping stakeholders step through how do we, either one, do we have enough, or two, do we need to make a change, and whether that's change from an operating perspective or an infrastructure perspective, and step you through answering those questions. Our methodology is not trying to, like in a simulation model, try to simulate all of the types of activities that occur on a railroad and provide metrics based on that. It is a way of quantifying what you have and how you want to use it, and then you can either simulate it or you can take it and say, you know what, we know we have enough. Now we just got to figure out how to make the best of these assets and resources we have without necessarily spending money and taking time to construct stuff.
Go to the second step, how best to utilize it.
Not in a vacuum. You would need to have engaged stakeholders, which is what we've had in other projects where we have stakeholders where then we can look at this and go, all right, what do we do from here and how do we target this? And we've, in other studies, then look at operational improvements and all that sort of stuff that I've articulated.
You did say, I believe, that your study doesn't measure impairment, I think, when Mr. Askins asked you. Is that right?
That's correct. We don't measure impairment.
Well, the statute we're operating under says that we are supposed to consider the institution of passenger trains will impair unreasonably the freight service. So I'm trying to figure out how we can use all of the testimony you've given us to try to decide this case under the statute under which we're operating. It may be in other areas that your approach to this is very helpful to a railroad or to other stakeholders, but I'm trying to figure out how it relates to our statutory standards. I wonder if you could explain that as you understand it.
Yeah, so I think what I would say is that from a board perspective, you can, with how you consider our analysis is that there is capacity on the corridor. There are certainly, as we've identified, some places where the capacity is going to be fully allocated or is very close to fully allocated. And a potential short-term step is for the stakeholders on the corridor to work in an open, transparent manner where they can figure out how can we squeeze the most out of the capacity that we have in the short run. Now, whatever comes in the future is what may come down the line, but at least here can identify that maybe there are some places where we can where stakeholders can work together tactically in the short term to figure out how to best use the capacity that's there. But that, again, based off of the experience we've had in other studies, that requires stakeholders that can have a very, open dialogue with one another.
All that's a good idea. And it might be great if there was a statute that says bring a petition to order everybody to work nicely together. And we may give such an order anyway. But for the moment, we've got a statute to apply. And I can't figure out if just having enough capacity, how that results in how these trains will run, including whether the passenger trains can run at 60 miles an hour, which is what the statute says should be at least the target. So let me ask it this way. If I get on the Kennedy Expressway at Chicago and there are only 10 cars there, I can go 70 miles an hour if I want. You can put another 10,000 cars on there and the whole traffic moves, but it moves at 30 miles an hour. Is that capacity? I mean, how am I supposed to understand this, the results of this study of yours?
The highway example probably is a good one because I think, or in that, what is capacity? And I think, as I've seen, this is my first proceeding like this, is that quantifying capacity is hard. And we're trying to have, or we've developed a methodology that, we think has merit in being able to actually quantify that, which has been something that I have seen through these proceedings. It is hard to see what is capacity. What is the capacity of the Kennedy Expressway? Is it 10 cars? Is it 10,000 cars? This at least gives an idea of, I have a measurement. I have a yardstick of which to make measurements and comparisons to and see, yes, I've got enough, or, no, I don't have enough, or I'm somewhere in between. And we can at least quantify that. And then we can know we got to work in this area and target work in this area because this is where we need to focus our efforts. And it's not as kind of nebulous as the Kennedy example you provided.
An assignment for which your particular expertise was not well suited, given the statute we're operating under. It may be suited for other purposes, but I'm just wondering about that. Karen has some questions for you.
I think what you said at the beginning is that your methodology is a planning tool. And what your report indicates is that there is sufficient capacity on this line to accommodate all the trains, assuming a perfect service plan.
Do you want me to respond to that? I don't know if I cut you off. I'm sorry.
You can accommodate the trains, assuming a service plan that has the trains leaving at a certain time and running behind each other at headways, et cetera. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. We don't define a service plan. We certainly do not, set out to do work or to deliver work where we drop on the table and say, here's a service plan and here's everything should work, because that, yeah, it does not produce a service plan. It certainly can help start pointing you. It can help define how you use the capacity already in sort of that highly variable nature that is freight railroad operations. It can also help point you down the path of, well, what if we got a little bit more precise, or what if we knew, or we can say with certainty that these two trains want to meet at this place every day at this time. And even then, you don't even have to do this methodology. If you have two trains that want to be at A at the same time every day, then just put a siding at A and then run the plan. So yeah, we're trying to find a way to quantify how the capacity is used in an imperfect world.
Going back to the highway example, It's my understanding that you can increase the actual operating capacity of a highway by having all the cars or all the trucks in one lane run in tandem. And that's what I mean by, you have to assume an operating plan. But your report doesn't result in an operating plan. It simply says maybe there's a potential for an operating plan that could accommodate all the trains.
That's a fair understanding, accurate understanding.
All right. Mr. Donahoe, you have some questions? How long a cross-examination do you, pardon me? 20 minutes. All right, let's try to get through it. We've got a hard stop today at 6. I hope we'll finish way before then. Mr. Wimbush, you still have some cross-examination?
Yes, we do. And I think it will be, some of it was territory already covered and raised. I've been listening intently, and I'm going to try to be judicious in the questions I ask. I'm relatively confident at this point that it will be under an hour. Given where we are in the day, I think confident we can hit your target. I for the same reason as you, want to hit that target.
I don't go out of my way to compliment Ray, but I don't know what's left, to be honest. But and then Jesse, you've got redirect, obviously. Do you have any idea how long that will be based on what you've heard so far?
Relatively short based on what I've heard so far.
All right, Mr. Donahoe, proceed with speed.
Mr. Johansson, is it your understanding or belief that it's the position in Norfolk Southern that there is not capacity for passenger rail currently on the back belt?
Can you say that one more?
Sure. Is it your understanding that it's the position in Norfolk Southern that there is not capacity to add passenger lines on the back belt?
I guess I don't completely know what Norfolk Southern's view is, though. And certainly they've asked for projects on the back belt.
The capacity marketplace methodology that was developed by DB Engineering, correct?
Yes.
And you testified on direct that that was a new approach for measuring capacity, correct?
Yes.
Has that new approach ever been used or presented before the STB, before this hearing?
No.
Has this approach ever been accepted by any federal regulatory agency in any type of proceeding?
No.
Has this methodology been peer reviewed or published in any manner?
No.
And you would agree with me that the RTC model has been used many times before the STB?
I don't know how many times, but I do know it has been used before the STB.
And if I wanted to, I could go and purchase the RTC model. Isn't that accurate?
I believe so, yes.
There's a licensing agreement with the RTC modeling, correct?
I've never tried to buy it, but I won't dispute it.
Could I purchase your capacity marketplace methodology anywhere?
You could hire me and have our methodology.
No, and I understand that. I mean, like I could go out and purchase the RTC modeling if I wanted to do modeling. Is there anywhere I could purchase your capacity marketplace methodology and use it myself?
Well, we don't have it's not a software product. So it's in that sense, there's not a software product that you can purchase. It's a concept and it's a methodology, and it's a way of kind of approaching a problem.
So since it's not a software project, freight railroads and Amtrak, they don't have modelers inside their companies that use this approach.
Not that I'm aware of.
And you've heard testimony that both Amtrak and the freight railroads, they do have people inside their companies that do RTC modeling.
Yes.
And I think if I heard your testimony correctly, your verified statement didn't include specific on how you calculated staging, variability, ramp removal. Is that fair?
Objection mischaracterizes the testimony.
Sorry, you say that again?
Sure. I thought I heard in answers to Mr. Atkins, because he asked you how you calculated all these things. And my question is simply, in your verified statement, do you include specifics on how you calculated staging, variability, and ramp movements?
I believe in our verified statement, we talked about the approach, but we didn't show like an actual formula.
Okay, so therefore, and there's been a lot of talk in this hearing about validation. Since that is not laid out in your verified statement, it would be difficult for our experts to validate your modeling.
I don't know how hard it would be for your experts. I don't know.
But you agree that you did not lay out the specifics for how you did your modeling in your verified statement.
I believe we articulated in our verified statement the approach we used, though we did not necessarily show a specific formula.
In any of the projects, the other three projects, I think it was three, that you used this capacity marketplace methodology. Was there any of those places that had the same characteristics as the Gulf coastline?
Like what kind of characteristics?
Sure, I'll give them to you. So in the Gulf Coast, it's approximately 150 miles of single track, 13 movable bridges, 160 grade crossings, and the intersection of 6 Freight One railroads along with a port.
We've done analyses on railroads with single track. We've done analyses on railroads with multiple ports. We've done analyses on routes with multiple other connecting railroads. We've done analyses on routes with lots of grade crossings, though I can't quantify the number. And though I don't know if we've done one with a movable bridge.
Okay, and just to be fair, my question is, in any of these projects, did it have a combination of all these factors that I just described to you?
With the exception of the movable bridge, we've done a project where all those other ones were included.
And in your verified statement, I think you recommended 3 projects. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And to be fair, again, you believe that Amtrak can begin passenger service on the Gulf Coast prior to the installation of those 3 projects, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you've heard testimony about the Gulf Coast Working Group, haven't you?
Yes, I have heard some.
And your verified statement only recommended 3 projects, whereas the Gulf Coast Working Group recommended several more than the 3 projects.
I believe, as I said earlier, I don't recall all the details of the Gulf Coast Working Group.
Okay, well, I think we can take notice, because there's been a lot of testimony about it, that the Gulf Coast project involved more projects than what your verified statement has recommended. But you're not aware of that?
I'm not intimately familiar with all of the number and the details of all the projects in the Gulf Coast.
Well, one of the projects, and there's been testimony to it from the Gulf Coast Working Group, is the Gentilla Yard. Have you heard any testimony about that?
I do recall some testimony about Gentilla Yard.
And the Gulf Coast Working Group recommended a bypass at the Gentilla Yard. Do you recall that?
I do.
Is that one of the projects you recommended?
No, we did not recommend that.
Have you heard testimony that Amtrak has agreed and has adopted the projects recommended by the Gulf Coast Working Group?
I don't know what Amtrak has agreed to or not agreed to on any of the Gulf Coast Working Group projects.
Well, hypothetically, if Amtrak has taken the position that they agree with the infrastructure suggested by the Gulf Coast Working Group, you would agree that's different than the 3 projects you've recommended.
Can you say that one more time?
Sure, I'm sorry, I might be speaking too fast. I think we've established that there were more projects suggested by the Gulf Coast Working Group, more than 3 projects. Are you with me there?
I'm with you.
Okay. So would you agree with me that if, in fact, Amtrak has taken the position that they are adopting or in agreement with the projects from the Gulf Coast Working Group, that would be different from your recommendations of the 3 projects? Just in numbers alone.
I guess if anyone has agreed to a project with 4 or more projects, then yes, they've agreed to something with more than 3.
Okay, so if hypothetically the Gulf Coast Working Group has recommended 8 infrastructure projects and you've only recommended 3, you would agree there's a difference there?
Yes, I agree. 3 and 8 are different.
And the 3 projects that you recommended, and I don't know if this is part of, what you do, did you give any estimates or cost estimates to what those projects would entail?
We did not.
In your verified statement, you said that the back belt was unoccupied 75% of the time. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And did you do any calculations or did you look at any data as to what was occurring that other 25% of the time?
So as I recall, it was our calculations there were that the back belt was not being used 75% of the time, therefore it was being used. The rest was, this was a binary thing. So the rest was being used 25% of the time.
No, and I understand that, but I guess my question, and it was poorly phrased, is more, did you look at what was occurring during that 25% of the time?
We didn't break it out other than we thought trains were moving or were on the corridor during that time.
Okay. Now, I heard your testimony that you didn't go down to the Gulf coastline for this project. Have you ever been to the back belt?
When I was about 14, I rode the Crescent over it.
Okay, so that was a long time ago. All right.
I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. Would you agree with me that individuals as Mr. Johnson and Mr. Hunt and Mr. Guthrie and people who have been along the Gulf Coast corridor and have been at the back belt are in a better position to testify about the capacity and the future projections in adding Amtrak passenger trains to the line?
Objection. It's not for Mr. Johansson to evaluate the.
Why is it you never went down to the back belt?
Never felt a need to. Felt that the information that we had was sufficient to do our analysis.
And the same response with why you were never on the Gulf coastline, the rest of the Gulf coastline?
That's correct.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Mr. Wimbush, if you are going to be short, I'd like to do that. Then we'll take a break. All right. Why don't you come up here? We'd all like to see your new shirt. Whatever it takes.
Do you need a break or are you okay? Okay.
As part of your presentation, we have to critique your output.
Yeah. Rob, you did very well.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I didn't realize under that kind of pressure and scrutiny today, but more than ordinary.
We pay close attention to every aspect of this case.
Yes, sir. Mr. Johansson, before I begin, I just want to let you know that there could be some pauses in between my questions. That's simply my attempt. I've been listening very carefully to your testimony. As a consequence, I'm trying to cull some of the questions that I otherwise would have asked you in the interest of brevity and accommodating the agency as well. So appreciate your accommodation with that. If you're patient with me, I'll be patient with you.
Indeed. Mr. Johansson, in reading your verified statement and your report, I did not find many references to the Port of Mobile or the Terminal Railway Alabama State Docks, TASD. In fact, I only found one, which was at page 9 of your report. Does that seem about right?
Yes, that's about right.
Why was that?
We had no train movement data for a couple reasons. One, none of our analysis touched anything that the terminal railway may consider a main track because Amtrak did not operate on those tracks. The other thing is that we did not have operational data, and what I really mean specifically this like OS signal data for movements that occurred on the terminal railway property.
So, in follow up to that, that from the prior testimony that TASD operates between Seibert Yard, technically from Interchange Yard, which is adjacent to Interchange Yard, and from Seibert Yard down to the McDuffie facilities, which is a segment that you studied. And if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying that you don't agree that the tracks that TASD uses are the same tracks that that Amtrak's trains would use.
No, to the extent that TASD movements operate on the CSX track and those movements passed by a signal and that signal recorded that event and that event was in the OS data provided by CSX, those movements were included in our analysis.
I see. How many TASD cross-corridor train movements did you include in your capacity marketplace analysis?
We did not break the movements out by operator.
So you don't know, or you didn't try to segregate them in some way from the other train movements you saw between Seibert and Choctaw?
Yeah, to the extent that any train movements in the CSX data set, that was included, but we didn't try to identify or break out or categorize by operator.
And I think you've been saying that you determined your freight train volumes from the OS data. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you said that, I think you just said that the OS data
also allowed you to ascertain, however, which of those train movements were TASD train movements and which ones were not? No, we weren't able to, well, we didn't attempt to say these movements on CSX property are CSX trains, presumably operated by CSX employees, and these trains are TASD trains operated by TASD employees. If it was a train movement on that property, it was just counted as a train movement.
Okay, but you do know that TASD trains compared to CSXT trains between Seibert and Choctaw function differently. That is that they take different routes. As an illustration, that you may have a train that exits TASD's riverfront yard and then traverses the CSX corridor to get back up to interchange yard, something that CSX trains don't do, correct?
Okay, yeah, so a train takes, I think what I would call from my experience, a headroom move out of one yard and then shoves into the other yard.
Okay,
Is
I think so. What I'm trying to get at here is that but you were able to ascertain that from the OS data?
Again, we weren't looking at a specific move. So again, whatever those, to the extent that those movements did exist and were in the data, that was included in our calculations, but we did not specifically try to look at and say a movement, whether it was a TASD movement or a CSX movement, came out of one place and then backed into another place.
In light of the written and oral evidence supplied to this point and the direct and cross-examination to this point, is it still your opinion that Amtrak's proposed service can be initiated without any immediate infrastructure improvements?
Yes.
You seem to recommend the construction and utilization of a station track in downtown Mobile. This is something that's been discussed, but you seem to have recommended that, correct?
Yes, we did offer or suggest the construction yes, we suggested the construction of a mobile station track.
So if your conclusion is infrastructure is not needed, why recommend that?
Because we did recognize that there were places that were either at or getting very close to capacity and wanted to make recommendations of things that could be or should be looked at.
Well, since you recommended it, did you have a time frame in mind for the deliverable for delivery of that particular project?
No.
I see that your analysis assumes that Amtrak will operate. In fact, I will refer you to tab 8. Try to get here quickly. Tab 8, page 28.
Yep, I'm there.
Couple of quick questions about that. Your tab here indicates that Amtrak will operate over CSXT's main one only between CP State Docks and Choctaw. Is that correct?
I think we have here on Cyber, but I think
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I did say State Docks. I see that your segments are based on Cyber to Choctaw. So Cyber to Choctaw. Your Amtrak trains will operate only on main one.
Yeah, but I think I think State Docks is actually technically south or east of Cyber, but yes, we would be on main one.
Okay. But you've heard from Ricky Johnson that in order for these Amtrak trains to move from main one at the station to Choctaw, in the absence of a station track in Mobile, that those Amtrak trains will have to cross over onto main 2 in order to access Choctaw Yard. Isn't that correct?
At CP Choctaw double track, the double track ends, the siding ends and you either go into Choctaw Yard or you stay on the main track. So our calculations don't, it doesn't matter because you're at the end of the track or, we're going into the single track section at that point. Or whether you're on 2 or 1, you're going from that divergence point down to a single track.
So
From a main track perspective.
I'm a little confused that you've got 2 main tracks to CP Choctaw from the north,
Right.
and you're contemplating a crossover move that will, at a minimum, block the access to main 2 through that same control point. So why did you not factor in any consumption of capacity on main 2? Are you saying I can run through that same crossover on main 2, even when an Amtrak train is running to Choctaw or from Choctaw?
No, but main 2 ends there. You go on 1 and then main 2 ends at CP Choctaw. And then you have either a route into the yard or you stay down the main.
In your opinion, would your analysis have been aided by an RTC analysis?
No.
Would you agree that the 2 in tandem, however, would have been a more effective approach in assessing operational impact of Amtrak operations, capacity, and potential service adjustments?
Objection, Foundation.
Question again.
I said, would you agree that the 2 in tandem, that is a RTC study and this capacity marketplace analysis, would have been a more effective approach to assessing the operational impact of Amtrak operations, capacity, and potential service adjustments?
But he could answer whether he has a foundation to answer the question.
So I'd say, as we've talked about, is that our methodology could be taken standalone or it could be used as an input to an RTC study.
Under your analysis, how many units of capacity would a TASD cross-corridor train consume?
I would have to know the specifics of a specific train, but if it moved essentially in the same speed as the standard train, it would consume and was not delayed along the way, then it would consume 1 unit of capacity.
So given what you know and have heard about TASD train operations, does your study account for TASD trains as a standard train, as you've defined a standard train?
Any movement gets compared back to the standard train, whether it's CSX or a TASD train.
I'm sorry, is yes or no? I'm not trying to be, but is a TASD train movement between Seibert and Choctaw a standard train for purposes of your analysis?
Any movement from Seibert to Choctaw would be measured the same as any other train movement. So a TASD movement could be, in real life could turn out to be 1. It could be different. I don't know.
I'm not sure I got the answer to that. Is a TASD train that operates between Seibert and Choctaw a standard train in your analysis?
Whatever the TASD train looks like would just be compared back to the standard train. So we're not assuming that a TASD train is 11,000 feet or 1,000 feet. That standard train is simply an operational profile. So it would be, we're not making any assumption that a TASD train would run faster or run slower than the standard train. It would however it would actually perform would be compared back to the standard train.
Okay, so you have in your analysis a standard train and a passenger train. And I've asked you whether or not the TASD trains are standard trains, and I don't know if you've given me that answer. So I'm asking you, either is the TASD train a standard train, or is it a train not accounted for in your methodology?
Objection, asked and answered.
It is, he's answered your question is the only way he's going to answer it, Rob. There's nothing more
Fair
to
enough.
pursue.
Fair enough. Are you aware that daily freight train movement volumes can vary across segments of your corridor?
Yes.
And you did include train performance variation or variability in your analysis, correct?
Yes, that would be the variability.
So how did you account for train volume variability in your analysis?
We didn't escalate high or low. We took the average train count.
So you took I'm sorry, say that again. You took an average train count, is that correct?
Yes.
So looking again at your page 28 in page 28 in tab 8, Amtrak Exhibit 6, and focusing on Cyber to Choctaw. What you're showing me here, as I understand this, so help me if I'm correct on this one, is that what you're showing me is what the capacity would be in your estimation with Amtrak trains on an average day. Is that correct?
The units of capacity is fixed. That doesn't vary at all.
The units of available capacity are you talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me finish. The demand placed on there, the Amtrak demand is constant. The staging is constant. So whether you have a good day or a bad day, that staging number stays the same. And then we have the average train count and then the variability that goes with that train count.
What would happen to this one column here, Cyber to Choctaw, on an above average day? Excuse, let me rephrase that. On an above average day in terms of the total number of freight train movements.
If you had more trains than counted, then you would have an addition, you'd have a greater demand on capacity that day if you had more trains than what's on here.
So is it possible, based on some of the variations you may have heard from TASD testimony, is it possible that on an above average day, the capacity between Cybert and Choctaw, assuming that all of that capacity could be routed to Main 1, would still be exhausted or fully consumed?
It is possible that if you had more trains show up, but regardless of whether it was TASD or CSX, that you would have all the capacity consumed.
Thanks. Looking at that same chart, I'm looking at, again, Cyber to Choctaw. And if I'm looking at this correctly, I see that you have in green on-ramp movements on track Main 2, and it looks like none on Main 1. Why no on-ramp or I suppose off-ramp movements? I'll get to that. Why no on-ramp movements on Main 1?
I believe as recall because that accounts for, I believe that accounts for trains going into Choctaw Yard.
Do you know that there are TASD trains that are neither entering nor exiting Choctaw Yard, but are entering and exiting from Riverfront Yard and Interchange Yard? Okay, but you did not attribute any of that on-ramp or off-ramp activity to Main 1, is that correct?
I think Our analysis went up to, but we didn't go past Cybert. So that would be beyond there with those, I believe those additional yards.
So are you assuming then, for purposes of this operation, that a TASD train would immediately move if it exited, because you're saying that Cybert you think is south of where we come on, that we would never occupy Main 1 for purposes of our on-ramp or off-ramp. We would immediately go on to Main 2.
I don't recall us ever looking at any sort of switching movements at any level of detail by that area, because that was past the convention center and past where the Amtrak service would end.
So did you look at any of the maps that were supplied as part of this proceeding to see where interchange yard, TASD's interchange yard connects into the CSX corridor?
I think we looked at it, but again, that's because that was beyond where the proposed Amtrak service would end. Our analysis really stopped at the Mobile station.
Your standard trains, if I understand correctly, represent a total of 2.4 units of capacity. A standard train is 1, but with the variability factor, how many units of capacity does in any given segment, how many units of capacity does a standard freight train consume?
So it's any movement, not a standard train. Any freight train movement is essentially the one for the standard train slot or unit, and then the additional 1.4 in variability.
Okay, so 2.4 units of capacity. So if I added, for example, another standard freight train operating between Cybert and Choctaw, it would consume, and I put it on Main 1, under your Amtrak scenario on page 28, it would consume under your methodology an additional 2.4 units of capacity. So how many more trains can I add over your average day analysis between Cybert and Choctaw before I exceed capacity? Standard freight trains, how many can I add between Cybert and Choctaw in theory before the capacity is, again, to use your term fully consumed?
2.
I just have a few more questions for you. Are you familiar with the term first mile, last mile railroad service?
Yes.
Would you agree that TASD is involved extensively in first mile, last mile service based on your observations of TASD activities or what you know about it?
I don't know. I can't use the word extensive, but I know that TASD is involved in first mile and last mile service.
And do you know the TASD service and train operations, are shaped by the service needs of both its customers and its interline connections?
Objection foundation.
He knows.
Say the question one more time.
Said, do you know that TASD service and train operations are shaped by the service needs of both its customers and its interline connections?
I think that's applicable for all railroading.
Fair enough. I think I heard you say yesterday that altering freight service schedules to accommodate other capacity demands can be a challenging undertaking. I may be paraphrasing here, but does that sound about right?
Yeah, that sounds good.
And do you think, based on your professional experience with freight railroading, and I see that you have quite a bit of it, that might be especially true for TASD given ship calls, stevedore demands, yard capacity management, interline coordination. Let me get back to the original question. Given those circumstances, do you think that adjusting and accommodating passenger service, let me rephrase you. So I've asked you about service schedules and accommodating capacity demands. And I've mentioned to you about things like ship calls, stevedore demands, yard capacity. Do you think that the challenges of making the adjustments that you're articulating in your methodology and in your presentation would be especially difficult for TASD?
In my experience, no doubt it is challenging, but that has never, in my experience, kept us from trying and often reaping the benefits from when we did try.
I have no further questions.
Jesse, what's your estimation on your redirect?
I think about 10 to 15 minutes, but I would like to take a break.
So what, you would like a break?
Yes, please.
I think that's a wise request. Thank you.
How long are we breaking for?
Well, unfortunately for all of you, we're now refreshed. All right, we are ready to go back on the record. Usha, can you turn us on?
You're on, Marty. Thanks.
I think we have to hear the recording started message.
The recording's on.
Okay, all right, thanks, Usha. All right, Jesse, proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Johansson, Mr. Wimbish asked you a number of questions about kind of the standard train and how that relates to real world trains. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of clear up any confusion about what a standard train is as compared to a real world train. And if you need to refer to page 15 in tab 8 in order to do so, feel free.
Yeah, so to clarify, a standard train is defining an operational profile. So you could have right, there's all types of trains that operate on any railroad corridor, not even just specifically in this one, right? Some are long, some are short, some are heavy, some are long and heavy. There's these, almost a limitless world of combinations. The standard train is just trying to create a profile of a train that you can measure back to. And some way you can think about it, it's like creating an inch. We all know what an inch is, and we can make we can make comparisons back to that inch. We've just created a measurement unit.
And the standard train here, can you just tell us what it was based on again?
It was based on actual train events on the CSX portion of the corridor. So any train that passed a signal on the CSX corridor, those events were recorded. Those events went into here.
And you testified, you were also asked a lot of questions about variability. And can you explain, in your experience of both of applying your methodology, what has happened to variability in other instances in which passenger service has been, your methodology has been applied or passenger service has been introduced?
So in none of our previous studies were we asked, that many of them have been planning studies, so they're not quite to implementation, and other ones where there has been some amount of implementation, we were not tasked to calculate variability after the fact. What I can talk about, in analysis that we did perform after the implementation of a schedule in one corridor, was by creating a much more conservative train profile. This is speaking to Chicago on the Metro BNSF line. Previously, there was a much less conservative type of train could be operated during the corridor during the peak periods. The train had to be highly powered, generally short, generally pretty light. We went with a conservative train parameter, built the passenger schedule around that. And then BNSF was able to operate longer, heavier trains during the peak period in more places than before. So we were able to create opportunities that, while we did not calculate it, that trains that may have been previously maybe were delayed waiting for a slot in, could now run almost unimpeded into the corridor.
So when you increase capacity on a line, does variability sometimes decrease? or I'm sorry, when you increase the train count on a line, does variability sometimes decrease?
What we have observed in studies is that when train count increased, variability went down, which seems sort of counterintuitive. But then as you think about it, because you have a constrained resource in terms of a railroad, and when you're placing more demand on it, you have to use it more efficiently. And so thinking back to my experience, when we knew we had busy days, we were much more on top of getting crews out to trains and thinking ahead and being much more tactically engaged in the operation of the railroad, because again, we knew we had limited resources and a lot of demand on that.
And I believe you testified that once you know that you have sufficient capacity on a line, then you just need engaged stakeholders to sort of engage in operational planning. Is that correct?
Yes.
And based on what you've heard of the testimony and the positions of the railroads here, of CSX and NS, could you just speak to what you think that would require of CSX and NS in this case?
Yeah, it would, I think, require an open, transparent dialogue of service plans and needs and goals, and then work through them, and from there you can generate, I think, really good solutions to problems.
So it will require, for example, a willingness to change an operational plan.
Yes, it might.
It might require a willingness to model changes to an operational plan.
Yes, it might. Yes.
And it might require not insisting on the status quo.
Yes.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions.
Well, for the record, Amtrak is finished, correct, with your live testimony?
Yes, we are.
And I think we established at the outset that the railroads were putting on their opening case and rebuttal all at the same time, so you don't have any rebuttal testimony, at least at this point.
That's correct.
All right, well, I'm going to make some observations. We've had plenty of time during the course of this hearing to receive and weigh and think about what we've been hearing. And I think, as you might imagine, forming views and then reforming them and changing them and listening to everything that we've heard. And I am going to make some observations and some requests or suggestions. But I want to emphasize at the outset that the board has made no rulings. Jesse, you're trying to speak.
I was just going to ask if prior to that, Mr. Johansson might be excused.
I am sorry. Thank you, Mr. Johansson. Thank you very much for your patience. And yes, you are excused. The board, other than the evidentiary rulings we have made, has made no rulings in this case and is not making any rulings today. I am going to make some observations and some requests on where we are in this case. And and we will move from there. And I have been making a lot of notes, so this may not be the most orderly, and it may not even be as complete as I'd like it to make, but I think I could get my observations out here, and I'm going to ask all of the other board members to weigh in with their own views on this and add or detract from anything I may say. Let me say at the outset, this is, as I think all have agreed, an unprecedented hearing. We're implementing a statute which has never before been utilized. And I don't know the long history of the ICC, but I'm told in terms of hearings on the record, been a long time. If there ever was one, it's certainly been a long time. And I see experienced counsel nodding that maybe never. So we are breaking some new ground here. I also want to underscore that while this proceeding has proceeded in the nature of a trial with formal sworn testimony, examination, and cross-examination, as I have expressed, I think others have too, but I certainly have from the very beginning, that that the board has a strong duty to consider the public interest. And this is not like, in my view, simply private litigation between two parties. It is to a large degree, but it's our duty, in my view, to watch out and protect the public interest. And that is why I am going to make these observations, if my hand doesn't get tired. I think you can all tell from the questioning that has gone on really from day one that the board members have queried about the exploration by the parties of the issues which we think we have to deal with and which we have observed may well not have been sufficiently addressed by the parties to date. The statute we're operating on says that the board shall consider, and that is very specific language that differs from other language, whether adding passenger service would, quote, impair unreasonably freight transportation. It also tells us to consider whether Amtrak can attain a system-wide average speed of 60 miles an hour, about which there's been virtually no testimony by anybody in this case so far, the 60 mile an hour part. Amtrak has taken the position in its pleadings and in its evidence that if we were to find that the railroads did not meet their burden of proof of showing that the service would cause unreasonable impairment, that's the end of the case and they simply can run their trains with no further conditions. The railroads, by contrast, and they say that in the face of evidence, I think any reasonable observer would say, of some impairment if you add 4 trains to an already existing line. The railroads, by contrast to that approach, have said, and I know they have tried to modify what's been said in the papers, but we've all read the RTC studies and the briefs. And while there's some back and forth, the overwhelming approach of the briefing and the RTC studies submitted to us by the railroads is that they have met their burden of proof because they are entitled to have, if there is to be passenger service, no degradation. That term has been used. And we've been told repeatedly that the infrastructure projects recommended by the RTC modelers are necessary to ensure that freight service is equal to or equivalent to the pre-passenger train service. And I, for one, don't read the statute as requiring no degradation or service that's equal to no had there never been passenger service. The statute talks about unreasonable impairment. Presumably the Congress expected there might be some impairment when they wrote that language. So I am concerned that the RTC modeling that has been supplied so far doesn't meet the standards of the statute. And there's been a great deal of discussion about other aspects of the RTC reports that have been submitted so far, particularly not only the no degradation part, but modeling the addition of infrastructure so that the Amtrak trains would run on a 95% on-time performance. And I know, and you've heard me question very carefully the witnesses on this, that there were efforts to walk that back, but I could also read the plain language of the opening RTC study, and it clearly said that, and I don't want to go back and read it now, that was one of the requirements of the infrastructure. And I think it may well have skewed the results of what's needed. At best, it's left murky because the witnesses tried to walk it back. There are other aspects of those RTC studies put in by the railroads that I find particularly troublesome. The railroad witnesses, I think Mr. Johnson, I can't remember all of them, I thought were quite candid in telling us that when they use RTC studies to model improvements of fluidity on other lines, when their infrastructure expenditures are at stake, and I think very articulately, one of these witnesses said, I don't want to spend $1 on rail or hardware if I don't have to, because then I have to maintain it. And that we always look at operational changes before we move to spend money on infrastructure. And yet, the RTC witnesses for the railroads made it very clear that one of their instructions when they were instructed to create their RTC studies was to make no operational changes, to not even model them. So to the extent that we are going to consider the case that's been put in by the railroads, which they have asked us and told us in their position under the statute, we can, in their view, order certain infrastructure as a condition of trains. I, for one, would be quite concerned, based on the evidence in front of us now, entering any order that could result in the expenditure of hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' dollars without knowing whether operational changes could minimize the need for that infrastructure. And my initial thinking about this statute is that when the Congress told us to consider unreasonable impairment, they didn't limit the ways that impairment could be avoided. And so it seems to me that only half a case has been presented to us in terms of whether there will be unreasonable impairment, and if so, how to avoid it. I'm left at this stage not being able to answer in my own mind whether the operational changes could be made to obviate the need for virtually all infrastructure, although everybody seems to agree on a station track in Mobile. But the rest of it, I can't tell based on the evidence that we have to date. And by the way, well, let me move on. There's one other aspect of the RTC study which I want to comment on, which I find troubling. And that is, although I thought the witnesses, for the most part, were candid and credible, I was very troubled. And maybe I base this partly on my own experience as a trial lawyer for some 50 years, that when this case was prepared for litigation, the experts on behalf of the railroads, I'm going to get their names wrong, Rossi and Sincanon, I think. Is that right? Sincanon told us that in gathering field data, and no one suggested they were lying or making things up, and I have no reason to think that they were and that they were not credible, but yet they did not keep any documentation of the data for 1,265 trains, which has led to a huge amount of litigation in this case. And it just strikes me that that undermines our ability to rely on the study, because I think all parties and lawyers involved in this litigation know that in our cases, reams of data are presented by both sides, and you have presented thousands of pages of data. But the one piece of data that was not produced in any way that anybody could examine it were these field interviews. And the fact that they weren't instructed to maintain them, I don't fault them, is troublesome. It undermines our ability to rely on it. On the other hand, I invited the Amtrak witnesses to tell us that they were lying and making things up, and nobody suggested they were. But I'm left somewhat troubled by the lack of it. And I say this, and much of what I am saying, by the way, is because everybody has agreed, both in this litigation and outside forces, that this is a case which is going to establish precedent for presumably many other intercity routes that Amtrak may bring to us. And I am saying to the railroads out there, if you're going to end up in a contested RTC modeling battle, which is sort of a half of what we have here, you should be forewarned that data should be maintained so it can be examined. You have a lot of data, but that was one piece that wasn't. And I don't want to see that happen again in the next case. On the other side of the coin, Amtrak has said for years that it supports the Gulf Coast Working Group recommendations, which at the time were priced at approximately $100 million. And we asked Amtrak witnesses about this. And I don't assume that Amtrak supported spending $100 million in public money if it wasn't needed for some reason. And yet they have supplied us with almost no facts on which to judge whether that's the right amount. And while they said they phased it in, which may well be very acceptable under the unreasonable impairment concept to phase in infrastructure, I'm not making any ruling because it says we're only supposed to consider it. It doesn't supposed to say we have an absolute bar on any kind of impairment to have passenger service, but they've supplied us with no facts on which to judge whether the impairment will be unreasonable. Will it take a year? Will it take 2 years? Will it take 6 months to build whatever infrastructure Amtrak says it supports? I find that to be a very huge gap in the evidence that makes it difficult for us to, for me anyway, to reach a decision. Other things that are missing, in my view, from this record are, and I've expressed this concern in other settings with railroads when they come in to tell us how great they're doing on velocity and dwell. Those kinds of metrics rarely tell me whether any particular customer is suffering or benefiting from the kind of service they're getting. And we have had no data presented to us that I guess could be described as impairment of customer-centric freight service. Now, I know one of the witnesses said, well, we don't go out and interview all 56 shippers on the line, and I'm not saying that's required. I'm not sure what's required, but what is missing is any indication on whether the 13-hour delay, the 4.5% reduction in velocity, and I'm just picking, there are many metrics in these RTC studies, what it really means to a customer. A customer who only gets service twice a week and doesn't need it more often may not be hurt at all by a 4.5% reduction in velocity. I can't tell. And I think that kind of impact of passenger service is missing. Perhaps a way to get at it would be to not identify 13 hours of delay, which one witness said divided up is, I think, 11 minutes, unless you divide it up in some other way, and maybe there is another way. But I would think some evidence on a train by train. We know there are through trains, there are local trains, yard trains, trains that make up consists. And we haven't been presented evidence on how to figure out where the delay is and whether it is, quote, unreasonable. The other thing we weren't given, either by Amtrak or by the railroads, is what is the benefit and impact of these individual infrastructure projects. If you're going to spend millions of dollars on extending a siding, what does that do for us? I don't know how to measure reasonableness without some understanding of whether any particular expenditure of millions of dollars is going to actually help the cause. All I got was an overview of what's needed for the cause in 2039. And on that score, by the way, I find nothing in the statute that tells us that when we, quote, consider unreasonable impairment, we're supposed to consider what that impairment might be on projected freight levels 20 years from now, which, while if you were a private business spending your shareholders' money, you might want to consider before you made an investment. I'm not so sure that the taxpayers are supposed to fund what is really a guess. Nobody knows what freight service is going to be 20 years from now. And the evidence we heard was these infrastructure projects are needed to have certain amounts of reduction in freight delay 20 years from now. I don't see that in the statute. So it concerns me about whether we're supposed to make a decision based on current levels of service or maybe in the next 2 or 3 years, but 20 years out strikes me as a little bit too long to commit public resources to at this stage. Another thing that I have found completely missing from the briefing and the evidence is that there was a round and around of briefing on the meaning of unreasonable impairment. And when you read through all these briefs, what you got was a very erudite circular argument based on which dictionary we should look at. And ultimately, all we got was unreasonable impairment is impairment which is not reasonable or is excessive or beyond reason, or words to that effect. I don't know that that's how this statute should be interpreted. It's a new interpretation. But to me, if I'm going to decide something is unreasonable, there's a lot of experience in the law about how one measures. We all learned in law school, I guess we don't say reasonable man anymore, but when I was in law school, we used the reasonable man standard, and there were ways to get at it. Do we look at, well, what is the velocity on CSX's overall network? What is the velocity on other lines that are similar to this? How do we know whether a velocity of whatever it is, 20 miles an hour or 14 miles is or is not reasonable? What do we compare it to? We've been given no guidance as to how to measure reasonableness. I don't know. I've mused myself. Is this like pornography? We know it when we see it. That seems to be the issue of the parties to say, well, we've given you numbers and those numbers mean it's unreasonable. I don't find that very satisfying way to interpret a very far-reaching statute. I just want to bear with me. I want to go through my notes here because there's a lot to say. The other thing that has not been modeled by anybody, and I find it problematic in terms of the railroad's case, you modeled just about everything. You even modeled what the difference is between a delay as of now with no passenger service and delay in 2039 with no passenger service. That wasn't reported in the RTC document, but it was in the work papers. And there's a significant amount of delay that's going to happen on this line if you never see a passenger train. And I don't know how we're supposed to take that into account, but the numbers are there. Staff found them in your work papers. I think it would have been more candid to have put that in. But more importantly, the RTC modelers for the railroads modeled what the impact of the $440 million in infrastructure would be on the 2039 case, and they modeled what the FRA infrastructure recommended projects would be on the 2039 case. But no one modeled what the FRA infrastructure would be on the 2019 case. And I have wondered why. I have wondered whether $100 million might not do the job. And its absence causes me, for the moment, to be inclined to a negative inference. But I'd rather not draw the inference. I'd rather see the numbers. So I find that a big gap in the evidence that has been submitted to us. There's been a great deal of testimony about the RTC model being the gold standard. I've always resisted in all kinds of litigation, anything being a gold standard, because it implies a kind of certainty that just doesn't exist in the real world, whether you're talking about medical treatment or railroad modeling. But the term gold standard is used. It was used frequently here. Interestingly enough, no one ever suggested that it isn't the gold standard. And I wondered why Amtrak did not do any RTC modeling. And to be candid about it, while I appreciate Mr. Johansson's expertise, I can't compare his study to the RTC data that's been presented. I asked the question, how do I compare the two? And it leaves me, and Mr. Johansson even said, his study doesn't deal with impairment. The statute tells us to look at impairment. So I'm not sure what use we can make of all of the work. I'm sure it was excellent work and detailed and very credible for some purposes, but it doesn't seem to me to address the issues we're dealing with. So I'm sure I'm leaving out some important observations, and I'm going to invite my colleagues to weigh in. But here is the recommendation I am going to make. I am going to recommend that we invite the parties to fill in these gaps in the evidence. And that we're going to give you a fairly short time to do so, because this case has dragged on far too long. And I'm doing this in part because when this case is over and we do issue an order, I wanted to not only decide this case, but because of the importance everybody has said on this being precedent setting, to set some goals, milestones, rules for how these cases are to be litigated. And I am quite mindful and I'm quite conscious of the railroads having the burden of proof. But because the railroads have the burden of proof, doesn't mean that Amtrak can necessarily prevail by offering virtually no contradictory evidence. And I don't see any evidence which undermines the RTC reports. Now, you may argue that the RTC reports fall on their own weight, and that's an argument I'm willing to entertain. I've expressed my concerns about the status of those RTC reports. But the real concern I have, and the reason that I want to invite the parties to fill in the gaps in the evidence, is that there is a huge public interest here. In my view, it doesn't serve the public interest by say, Amtrak chose a poor litigation strategy, and to quote my early professor, they should go hence without day, no trains. I think there's a real public interest need. The Congress has said so, to reinstate passenger service on the Gulf Coast, but only within the confines of the statute. I also don't think it necessarily serves the public interest by concluding simply that the railroads have failed their standard of proof, so start running 4 trains today with no infrastructure. There's been enough testimony to suggest that that would cause some disruption. I can't tell whether it's unreasonable, but there's enough that, particularly given the current state of affairs in the rail industry, we don't need to make it worse. And so I think in order to protect the public interest, we need to nail this down better. And that is another reason why I'm inviting you to provide us with more evidence along the lines of everything that I talked about. Now, you don't have to. I can't order you to try the case in some way that you choose not to try it, but you're entitled to take your stands and proceed at your peril. But I don't think that would be wise, and I don't think it would serve the future of our industry. And I like to think that although you're all contestants and adversaries, as you should be, that you all have some concern about this proceeding in a constructive fashion. So I am going to recommend to the board that we give you 30 days to do whatever additional evidence gathering here is. And I would like to note a couple of things. Number one, the railroads said in their rebuttal brief, and I'm partly taking the railroads up. Amtrak didn't join in this, but the railroads said, if the board wishes to see additional iterations of the 2021 Gulf Coast RTC model, in this case, it was to reflect the impact of the port's proposed projects, CSX and NSR are willing to perform any additional modeling that the board requests. My request is not so limited, but they've at least partly offered to do it. I would say to Amtrak, I'm quite sympathetic to your experts, Mr. Crowley and Mr. Fapp's statement that they couldn't duplicate all the evidence, but they can provide us with some additional evidence, and you can qualify it and you can argue about it. I'm not suggesting how you produce it, by using the RTC software as produced. And I think Mr. Fapp said he could load that on the computer and he can put in his own modifications and come up with some results, which basically requires you to assume, without condoning, the 1,265 contested trains. It will at least give us some better views from Amtrak's point of view on what happens if you model operational changes or the far less infrastructure than the railroads are asking for. Oh, there was one other point I wanted to make about the infrastructure. I asked the question during the presentation by the railroads of what the RTC rebuttal report was rebutting. And I will tell you, just speaking for myself, I put far less weight on the, what is that citing by the NS Yard called the field, not the, what's the name of it? The what? The lead, the freight lead, the freight lead, because it wasn't rebutting anything. It was mentioned in the opening RTC study. It wasn't recommended. It wasn't in the price. It said, in fact, it was left out because it was too expensive. And then the railroads came in uninvited, really, and said, well, we'd like to add another $80 or $90 million. I put less credibility on the need for it for that reason. If it was that important, I don't know how these expert RTC modelers could have missed it, or the railroads could have missed it. I'm not ruling that I wouldn't consider it, but I want you to know how I react as a person hearing the evidence. But I'm not suggesting, and as I said, none of these are rulings. They're really observations to try to help the parties figure out how they want to proceed with this case. I'm trying to be helpful to the parties, to the board, and most importantly, to the public interest. So I think there's an ability by all the parties to do these modelings, do operational changes, try to provide the insight on the customer-centric issues that we talked about, and fill in these gaps and come back to us. And assuming that you want to do that, once you have submitted the additional evidence, then I think it is essential that we reconvene and give the parties a chance to present that evidence and be cross-examined on it, which is one reason why we're not having closing argument today, because I don't think the case is over. Now, if you all come back and tell me that the case is over, then we'll schedule a closing argument. So it's up to you. I can't tell you how it's going to come out. Part of me wants to say both sides should lose, but that's really not possible. And I don't think, however, if we ruled on the evidence at present, the case wouldn't be over. If Amtrak were to prevail and start trains, the first thing that railroads would do under the other statutes is to come in here and say, we need to stop the trains because they're screwing up the freight service. And if it were the other way around, if the railroads prevail, Amtrak, I presume, would come back in with a new petition someday, because they seem to be committed, as I think they should be, to reinstituting passenger service. So one way or the other, this case is going to go forward. I'd like it to end in this case. And I would say only one other thing. On the question of settlement, it's more persuasive to me, Ray, and Jesse, I'd like you to, not that I don't trust Ray, but I'd like to hear it on the record that both of you think that the discussion last September was in the nature of a settlement discussion. I'd still like some written representation of what happened there in the record. But if there is a chance of settling it, I think based on the observations I made, it'd be a good idea for the parties to get together and settle it. If this were an old-fashioned Cook County courtroom, I'd take you both into chambers and get it done, but we don't operate that way, so I'm saying it in public. But this case has every reason to be resolved. And by the way, one thing that I've heard, and I would hope maybe you could agree to work it out. I thought that, again, I think it was Mr. Johnson who talked about, in the normal course, the various parties who are involved, whether it's two freight railroads or Amtrak and a freight railroad, they get into a room and they all work out these RTC studies by saying, well, let's try this or let's try that. That clearly did not happen here. It would be constructive, if you're going to present more evidence, to do it that way. I can't make you play nice. I could suggest it, but I think it would be much more productive if you did. If you choose to do it on your own and present us with evidence, that'll be fine too. But I think I've talked long enough. Let me invite my colleagues to say whether I've put too much in or left something out, or they disagree entirely with this approach, and then we can proceed. Does anybody? Yeah. Karen, does anybody? Nobody, I mean, you don't have to say anything. Okay.
I have a somewhat different view because of where I came from, because I spent 4 years at the Federal Railroad Administration. Our chairman has said that he wants the result in this case to let the world know, the railroads and Amtrak or other passenger rail entities, how cases should be litigated. Is that the result in this case would indicate to the railroad industry how cases like this, how requests for additional service, and Amtrak is looking for additional service all over the country, how these matters ought to be negotiated. And one of the things that has really struck me is the just profound lack of, as as was said in a movie once, what we have here is a lack of cooperation. A year ago, I was asked if I want to go back to FRA, and I said, no, I don't want to do that. Been there, done that. But I have to tell you, if I was the administrator of the FRA and Peter Schwartz came to me and said, we're being asked to put money into the Gulf Coast, and there's an RTC study that indicates how much that the railroads have said indicates how much additional infrastructure is needed, but they won't give us the information for us to evaluate it, I would have immediately picked up the phone and called the CEOs of your railroads and said, what the hell is going on? I don't care if you entered into an agreement with Amtrak to keep it confidential, but you certainly need to give that information to the funding partner, and we'll keep it confidential. But that was never explored. I have found the proceedings for the last number of weeks very frustrating. I'm not a litigator. I'm a deal lawyer. I want to see a deal. Frankly, we were up before the Congress T&I committee this morning and talking about what changes needed to be made in the statute and reauthorization. Had I been asked, I might have been tempted to say, let's excise the words after a hearing on the record out of the statute. I wouldn't have done that, but clearly I do agree with the chairman here that we haven't gotten the information we need to make a decision that's in the public interest. I hope you will take to heart what he has said, but from my point of view, the big failing in this case, one of the major failings in this case is simply the lack of the railroads in sharing information on a reasonable basis. I don't think necessarily any games were being played when that agreement was entered into, but certainly the parties didn't think it through. And if we're to go forward, we've got to go forward on these other corridors with complete transparency and sharing of information among the parties.
Since we were in the Congress this morning, I'm going to borrow their language and say I'm going to associate myself with the remarks of Karen Hedlund. I thought they were well stated. Thank you. Any other member care to speak? Robert?
Marty, first of all, I do want to thank all the parties in the room. Number one, it's been a long few weeks. And again, you guys are obviously truly professional. I mean, I think I got to thank all of you guys for, the 100 plus pounds of notebooks that you guys gave us. I have to go back and revisit the Paperwork Reduction Act on that. I don't think we actually broke any rules, but even the witnesses on both sides and they're agreeing to come before us, day after day and spending the hours that they did with us. It goes to honestly the importance and the value of this issue that we have at hand. So, and I wanted to acknowledge everybody in the room for doing what they're doing, representing. I know everybody's got their sides, but I have to say that I appreciate you guys coming forth and making that argument. And Marty brought forth. He said something earlier to one of the witnesses, and when he asked, did he think that one side was lying because of the information they did or did not bring forward, and they said no, they didn't think they were lying. And I think, for me, as summing up this whole endeavor, I don't think either side necessarily brought people up to lie or actually lied or didn't say. I just think that there's still some truths out there that we need to know. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not even a litigator, not for that. But I am, I believe, a keen listener of information and of what's going on. And I do join Marty on some of his comments, and that, I don't think that, in my opinion, that everything has come to light. I think both sides, I know, want to win. For me, it's not about either side. Honestly, it is the public interest, and where the public interest lies in this case, and how we decide it. So for me, it's I do agree with Marty. If we could get a little bit more information, maybe that'll make a difference, maybe it won't. But I'm willing to try that, because I'm not, I'm going to go through a lot of the information that you provided for us, a lot of the testimony. I'm not ready to make a decision yet either. And I think, for me, I'll even be specific, the RTC models, there are some that I wish would have been done on behalf of the railroads. From Amtrak side, I think even trying one, I think would have been, for me, good if they would have pointed out what they couldn't get or how they couldn't complete it. I think that would have been important also to see. I think in terms of the infrastructure, I think either side really has a bit to go to sort of prove, one, with Amtrak, why it's not necessary in the beginning to get it started, and from the railroads, why that number is sacrosanct. And, it's if it's not met, then, the world's going to fall apart from their side. So I think, again, I greatly appreciate all that was done and what was said. I mean, I want to say that first and foremost. I have utmost respect for all of you. I hope you all are able to take a nice vacation, after this is done. You deserve it. We all do too, although I probably won't get one. But I just hope that you look at the request that we're asking, not as I guess more busy work, but really just for us trying to understand better the situation that you're asking us to decide.
Michelle, did you want to say something?
First, thank you all for the incredible amount of work that you put in to this hearing. I just can't imagine how much time you've spent, and it's been incredibly informative. But I do share many of the views of what the chairman set forth. While I don't specifically support all of his views on the evidence, I do believe that in this situation, the parties would actually be in the best position to determine what the best outcome would be for the network. And I strongly support his words and encouragement for settlement. Thank you.
With everybody's expression of gratitude for the parties for the immense time and effort that has gone on the case thus far. And Mr. Chairman, I agree with giving parties the opportunity to supplement what we've heard, and would say that the work at the board is not stopping. We're continually looking at everything you've submitted, reviewing everything today and in the days prior. And I think what you're hearing from all of us is we want to get this right. So thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. A couple of other points, large and small, that I left out and that I'm prompted to by my colleagues here. One very small point, one of the things that was left out of the modeling was taking into account, and it may be small, but I think we need to be thorough, taking into account the future remote operation of additional bridges. There were two, I can't remember, 2 or 3, which will reduce the number of high rails. It's a small point, but it was left out, and yet you're looking for infrastructure for 20 years from now. So I know the modeler said, well, we can't control it. We can't make sure it happens. And by the way, it's pretty clear to me from what we heard from the Coast Guard that the Coast Guard is open to working out schedules to some degree. They do it on other lines. And I think you can model it, even if it's hypothetical. I don't think you're all in the dark about how the Coast Guard works with railroads. And you could put in some reasonable assumptions about what scheduling with the Coast Guard might do to alleviate some of these delays. And we'd take that into account if you put it in as a hypothetical. One point I wanted to make, particularly to Amtrak, and I'm not This is going to sound like I'm trying to tell you how to be lawyers. You're both way more accomplished lawyers than I am. But as I see it, what the Amtrak strategy has been a very risky one of basically relying on an argument that they failed in their burden of proof. I would have liked to have seen, and this is why one of the reasons of inviting Amtrak to do its own RTC modeling, an argument which said, in the nature of a motion to dismiss, let's assume everything they say is true, they failed. I'd entertain that argument, and that's an argument that's pending in front of us. But my inclination, having tried a lot of cases, is to say, you know what, I'll rule on that at the end of the case. And whether they've met their burden of proof could very much be influenced by what you put into evidence. So for example, if an RTC model showed that operational changes could avoid the need for the infrastructure, that would be important, and to my way of thinking, of applying the statute of whether the burden of proof has been met. Of showing unreasonable impairment, because if you can reschedule a train without spending taxpayers' money, maybe you avoid unreasonable impairment. And that evidence wasn't supplied to us, and I think it was Amtrak's job to do it. And I don't want to see Amtrak take that litigation strategy in the future. You can if you want, but I don't think it's constructive. Having said that, I have said since I got to the board, and I've said it emphatically since I've been chairman in every setting, and I'll say it in this one and echo what my colleagues have said. I would much rather in this complex industry that the parties resolve these matters themselves rather than our weighing in and give orders. Because I agree with Michelle that you are the experts in railroading and you know full well how to best manage it, but you don't seem to want to work together in this case. So that would be the best outcome for you to figure out how to make this work. And unless anyone thought I was just preaching about litigation, I'd really rather preach about settlement. I do want to add my appreciation and respect for the lawyers and the witnesses. Everybody has put in a lot of hard work. I will tell you, the board has worked very hard as well. But you all have, you're professionals. I may disagree with some of the things, but I respect your work. Every person who's witness and lawyer has participated in this case. My trusty chief of staff tells me that 30 days is June 11th. So that's a Saturday. So it won't be 30 days. It'll be 32 days, Monday, June 13th. And I don't want to invite people to spend more time. We need to get this case over. But if you have some true need for additional time, you can tell. I'm not ruling anything out. You can tell us anything you want to tell us when you leave here. But I am inclined not to recommend any extensions unless they're absolutely essential. If you're truly going to supply us with the evidence we want, we'd be open to it. But we have an obligation to get this case decided, and so do all of you. So let me just conclude by saying I invite all of you to get a transcript of this part of the proceeding, because I do not want to wait for our staff to try to take into account everything that has been said here since the close of the evidence and put it into an order. They may try to do it, and that would be fine, but I think I have been pretty clear. And so I don't want you to wait for an order before you begin to work to know what it is we expect. If you need clarification, you can obviously ask for it. But there may be some form of order along these lines issued, but don't wait for it. Get moving. So with that, Bill, you want to say something? I'm not going to cut you off.
I do, Mr. Chairman, with respect to getting a transcript. Right now, it's been a 2-week delay in getting the transcripts because that's just the way they operate business. And I just, obviously 2 weeks into 30 days. So I don't know if maybe they could issue us one of those rough transcripts like they did, but then stop doing that, something like that.
I'll tell you what, I think it's a fair point. There's a couple of ways to skin this cat. You can get somebody to transcribe the YouTube tape.
We have been doing that.
Yeah. So that should give you what you need to know.
Okay.
But if somebody wants to come back here and said it took me 2 days or 5 days, so can I add that on to get the transcript? So can I add that on to the 30? Yes, I think that's reasonable, but don't take 2 weeks. Because I have seen YouTube transcripts. I think there's enough in there that you know what I said, and I suspect somebody was taking notes on what I was saying. But it's a reasonable observation, Bill.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have something to say? If not, we will recess, and what I anticipate, if more evidence is submitted, that you will then hear from us of the setting of further hearing dates. What I'd like to hear is that you've settled the case. Thank you all again. See you soon.